In recent years, floods have been increasing in numbers and causing more and more damage all around the world. Excessive pumping of groundwater, the building of dams, the huge weight of buildings, all of this produces the same result. As the sea level rises, a number of coastal cities are sinking and becoming increasingly vulnerable. More than a third of the big urban centers located by the sea are now endangered. And along with them, the lives of millions of people are threatened. Given the stakes in economic and human terms, the scientists concur in saying that action must be taken quickly. But what should be done? How can these huge cities and their inhabitants be protected from flooding? Will it be enough to build walls, or must we reinvent the city of the 21st century? To address this urgent question, engineers, architects, and urban planners are trying to come up with solutions to reconcile man with nature. In Thailand, Bangkok is a striking example of an urban centre regularly subjected to floods. In this city, the floods have terrible consequences on the population and disrupt the country's entire economy. Every year, during the monsoons, the country receives rain which its agriculture benefits from. But because of global warming, this season has become unpredictable. The government usually regulates the flow of the rivers by means of dams, alternating the retention of the waters when there is rain and their release when there is drought. But in 2011, the authorities were completely overwhelmed by the situation.
Well, in 2011, there are so many monsoons come to the country, and especially to the northern part of Thailand. And there are too much water above the dam. We have 8 or 9 dams in the middle of the country. The dam operator, which is belong to the Electrical Generating Authority of Thailand, they're not so sure whether it will be a drought or not. So they kept the water for so long into about 60, 70, 80% capacity of the dam to make sure that they have enough water for the irrigation. But somehow, there is too much water. So they have to release the water. And in order to release the water, they release it so fast at some short time. So that's why we have the situation in 2011, that huge amount of water flow into the city of Bangkok, where there is no way to coordinate between them beforehand.
As a result, a huge quantity of water was released in the rivers. But before reaching the sea, the waters poured into Bangkok. Built in the 80s, the 170-kilometer-long King's Dyke normally protects the center of town from floods. But that year, it was literally submerged. The government then decided to raise it by 2 meters. More than 600,000 sandbags were deployed to save the city center. But on the other side of the dike, thousands of people were left to brave the flood. For 3 months, the inhabitants were forced to live in dire sanitary conditions. The water was contaminated by sewage and dead animals.
But the people behind the sandbag suffer. They want to take this bag, release the water into the city. So there was some fighting between the two sides of the people.
ดูความเน่าของน้ำครับแล้วมันมีกลิ่นเหม็นตลอดแล้วชาวบ้านจะอยู่ยังไงครับมีแต่ปกป้องเขตมินบุรีอย่างเดียวกลัวเขตมินบุรีน้ำท่วม
The army had to intervene to protect the dike from the anger of the population. Care for the victims of the flood was left in the hands of NGOs.
คือมูลที่ปอเต็กตึงเรานี่เรามีหน่วยกู้ภัยกู้ชีพและช่วยน้ำท่วมเนี่ย24 ชั่วโมง on day on night เตรียมพร้อม24 ชั่วโมงทำงานทุกวันก็เป็นข้อตกลงระหว่างเรากับเจ้าบ้านจะต้องถามมาก่อนเป็นความสมัครใจเจ้าบ้านว่าจะย้ายออกไปศูนย์พักพิงหรือจะย้ายไปที่ไหนถ้าเขาไม่ออกเราก็ต้องให้อยู่ที่เก่าแต่เราจะมีอาหารน้ำแล้วก็บริการติดต่อสอบถาม24 ชั่วโมงเกี่ยวกับเรื่องที่เศร้าที่แย่เนี่ยก็คือจะเป็นส่วนใหญ่จะเป็นผู้สูงอายุเนี่ยจะห่วงบ้านห่วงทรัพย์สินไงจะไม่ไปไหนเลยขนาดลำบากแค่ไหนหรือประเภทว่ายกพื้นอยู่ที่แคร่นะอยู่ที่แคร่เงี้ยแล้วหลังคาเตี้ยแค่นี้เขาก็นอนอยู่เงี้ยแล้ววันจะรับอาหารเนี่ยเขาลงเรือ
The human toll was disastrous, but the floods also had an impact on the national economy. Thailand, which at the time was the leading exporter of rice in the world, lost a quarter of its production.
You may already know that in the Chao Phraya Delta, this area, we have the rice production. And this is a rice bowl of the country. And we need a lot of water to make sure that in the dry season, during the flood, the production of the rice has been damaged.
In Bangkok, as elsewhere, floods have many repercussions. On the lives of the inhabitants, of course, but also on the financial stability of the countries concerned. In Washington, D.C., experts from the World Bank study the social and economic costs of such disasters.
Le problème du lien entre les inondations et la pauvreté, c'est qu'à partir du moment où les pauvres sont plus vulnérables et perdent plus en proportion de ce qu'ils ont que les riches, c'est une machine à augmenter les inégalités. Donc, si vous êtes un petit peu plus pauvre que les autres, vous allez habiter dans une zone un peu plus risquée et vous allez perdre plus souvent ce que vous avez dans les inondations. Et donc, rattraper les plus riches va devenir encore plus difficile. Il suffit de 20 cm de monter le niveau de la mer et de prendre en compte ce mécanisme de subsidence pour avoir des risques d'inondation dans ces grandes villes côtières qui augmentent d'un niveau qui est autour de 6-7 milliards de dollars par an aujourd'hui à des chiffres qui deviennent absolument gigantesques. Donc, dans le scénario qu'on regardait où on ne fait rien du tout, on arrive à des coûts qui montent à 1000 milliards de dollars, mais attention, ce chiffre ne veut pas dire qu'on va en arriver là, parce que c'est un chiffre qui est tellement élevé. Tout ce qui montre, c'est que le scénario où on ne fait rien n'est pas un scénario réaliste.
When Bangkok was facing that severe flood, we realized that this city is not just a Thai city, it is a world city. There was a total economic cost of almost $45 billion because of the floods in late 2011. But perhaps even more striking is that the effect was felt all over the world. The price of hard drives for computers went up by 100% because 50% of hard drives in the world were being produced in and around Bangkok at that point in time. The supply chains were disrupted, about 6,000 roads were affected, one of the major airports was shut down. This is one of the challenges of globalization. It's a very integrated world, and Bangkok is very much part of that global supply chain. And we felt that, not just sitting here in Bangkok, but all over the world.
With the rising sea level, ground subsidence, and lack of protection, Bangkok has become extremely vulnerable, and the Thais have no other choice than to rethink the city.
The solution of moving is not possible. We cannot move, the ancient temple, the old thing, the palace, the Grand Palace. It's not possible to move. Okay, so what we have to do is we need to protect it.
il ne faut pas attendre une catastrophe pour agir. Ce qu'il faut faire, c'est exactement le contraire, c'est-à-dire agir avant la catastrophe. Le problème, quand on regarde la façon dont politiquement les choses se passent dans les pays, en général, les grandes transformations des réglementations ou bien les grands investissements de protection se passent après une catastrophe. La non-action n'est pas une option. Il va falloir investir dans les protections côtières dans ces grandes villes pour protéger la population et aussi protéger l'activité économique, parce qu'on voit que dans de nombreux pays, ces villes côtières sont centrales pour l'activité économique.
As urban populations grow, the big urban centres develop accordingly. But what are the different means of protection available to them?
When we think about sort of responding to flood hazards, there's really three things we can do in a general sense. We can retreat, so we can not live there in the first place, so there's nothing to be damaged. We can actually, the word we use is accommodate or flood-proof. You can make sure that if buildings are flooded, there's no damage, or maybe you can elevate buildings so they're above the floodwaters. Or you can protect, which is maybe what most people would think of, whereby you would build barriers and dikes or big sand dunes or whatever, things that keep the sea out of the city.
Building walls for protection. In China, this is a very old tradition. Engineers have taken inspiration from the Great Wall in defending coastal towns, and this is especially the case for Shanghai.
More and more frequency the extreme weather happened, especially in the summer season. If the typhoon, the annual high tide, and the storm and the flood in the upstream come together. So in this situation happened, sometimes the sea level will rise quickly. It just will reach the high 5 meters. And this is higher than the Shanghai's average altitude. If such extreme the situation happened, this is dangerous and very challenging for Shanghai. In Shanghai, there are maybe 100 kilometers such a dike. It's protect the Shanghai. In the whole China the coast area, they built 1,000 miles such a dike. And in the future, there are some provinces they want to build more. On one hand, the government built such a dike to reclaim the wetland for the agricultural land. On the other hand, this dike is also play such an important role to protect the people from the sea. But there caused another problem is there are a lot of the wetland lost.
Wetlands are natural buffer zones. They have a great capacity for retaining water and diminishing the intensity of floods. Their preservation is therefore essential.
But we have a lot of discussions, where should we protect? Where is our red line? We should protect it. The wetland is not only protect Shanghai, but also provide the habitat for a lot of species, the bird, the fish. So Shanghai government pay a lot of attention to wetland conservation. They built 2 nature reserves in the Yangtze estuary area.
Il faut à la fois réfléchir à des solutions les moins chères possibles, et c'est pour ça qu'il y a beaucoup de travail sur la préservation des zones naturelles et des zones humides qui permettent d'amortir l'effet des tempêtes et qui sont beaucoup moins chères que des défenses en dur. Et aussi, parce qu'on aura toujours besoin de défenses en dur et de digues et de protection solides, notamment pour les zones les plus denses, des moyens de financement pour que les villes puissent se les payer. On peut très bien imaginer avoir des zones côtières protégées par des murs de 6, 8 mètres, 10 mètres. On sait faire techniquement. La question, c'est est-ce qu'on a vraiment envie de vivre derrière des murs de 6, 8, 10 mètres?
Elsewhere in Asia, Japan is also exposed to a major risk of flooding, with earthquakes, tsunamis and typhoons. The region is regularly subjected to extreme weather events. In Tokyo, as in the rest of the country, the authorities have deployed an impressive protection system.
Tokyo is a major megacity, maybe the largest megacity. I don't know, Tokyo, Yokohama, maybe 35 million people, a lot of people. And when you get a lot of people, you're going to get subsidence. They have great engineers, and they started to understand the connection between human decisions and this rate of sinking. And they've largely changed their behavior as a country, as a city, and the rate of subsidence has basically stopped. So there's a great feedback with them between human decision-making, human action, and what's happening on the landscape.
To minimize flood risks, 300 years ago, the Japanese diverted the Tone River to make it flow into the Pacific Ocean instead of the Bay of Tokyo. The huge Arakawa Canal, dug in the 20th century, also helps to drain away excess water. And to complete the preventive measures, engineers have also created a vast underground drainage network.
地表にですね、大雨が降った時に地表で洪水が発生します。その洪水をこの地下施設に取り込むことによってですね、地上のですね、浸水被害というのを防ぐという役割を持っています。この施設、平成14年から稼働し始めまして、これまでに91回稼働しております。平均しますと1年間に7回程度稼働している計算になります。
To be able to cope with earthquakes, the underground network has many backup systems.
この施設はですね、発電システムも備えておりますので、大地震ですとか有事の際にですね、電源が断たれたとしても、この施設だけは稼働するようなシステムになっております。
This huge network is geared to deal with the types of extreme events Tokyo has experienced in the past.
It was 1959 when I was elementary school child. There came Isebei typhoon to central Tokyo area. At that time, my father told me to stay home, but I find out that even if I stay in home, the strong wind came to the house, and also the roof of my house was partially destroyed. So I was very afraid of storm at that time. I was 6 years old. There are a number of disasters, including storm surge, earthquake, high wind. So I selected Department of Civil Engineers to protect the Japanese island against those natural disasters.
In Tokyo, the port area is particularly vulnerable to flooding. Here, another system protects the inhabitants from high coastal waters.
For the case of storm surge or tsunami, the ocean water comes from bay and going into this channel and finally goes to this small river through this river mouth. And water go into the small river and going downtown Tokyo. And in downtown area, the water will flood over from place to place. So through this small channel, small river, the Tokyo is not well protected. The water can invade it into Tokyo downtown area. So we constructed dikes and defense walls and also water gate to protect this inner area. So we are now passing the gate, and inside of the gate, the height of the wall was almost 1.5 meters. But after we go out from the protected line, water gate, the height of the wall becomes 3.5 meters, higher than inside. So there are more than 20 important water gates to protect this area.
These floodgates are remotely controlled from a control center.
大きな台風が来た場合には、ここで私どもで管轄している10個の水門をこちらから操作することができます。スーパー台風が来た場合には、まず気象庁から大雨洪水警報が発令されます。水位が上がってきましたので、各水門の水位に注意してください。
了解しました。
私どもが配置につきます。
新柳川水門閉鎖水位に達しました。
了解しました。それでは新柳川水門閉鎖をお願いします。
了解しました。それでは操作に入ります。
新柳川水門閉鎖中です。ご注意ください。
The network of floodgates is also completed by sliding barriers within the streets of the city itself.
So here is a sliding door for storm surge barrier. And this door will move to this side in case of storm surge and coming, and here is a road. And road will be closed because on the other hand, the other side, the gate will come and will close this road and cars are stopped. So after the door is closed, this side is unsafe area. So the people should leave their car outside and then should walk into the safe area. It is possible for us to calculate how much we will lost for the case of flood due to storm surge. And this amount is far much greater than the cost for countermeasures. So we recommend that in order to stop this huge loss of fortune for the case of storm surge flood, it is necessary to strengthen present storm surge barrier and also heighten the total height of walls. And this is very much cheaper than the possible loss of fortune.
Japan has invested massively in systems of defense based on the behavior of typhoons in recent decades. But today, global warming has upset the projections of the engineers.
For the case of storm surge, the global warming is now playing a very important role. As increase of surface temperature of ocean, the typhoon intensity increases. And recently we find out that the tendency of behavior coming to Japanese island changed. Previously, typhoon or storm came to Japanese island, suddenly speed up and run away from the island. But recently, they stay longer in the island. So this is what we are afraid, that stronger typhoon comes to Japanese island and to Tokyo area.
Following the increasing gravity of natural disasters and the accident at Fukushima, the Japanese remain humble. Sometimes projections, however sophisticated they may be, are not enough to guarantee the safety of the population.
We civil engineers now changed our mind that previously we tried to make very strong structures. But now we changed. We construct coastal structure for protection purpose, but we still explain to the residents that in case of very high power of storm surge or tsunami, we should run away. We should escape. So we always have
evacuation planning in mind. And in case of emergency, go directly to safe place.
Walls, floodgates, evacuation systems, and risk awareness. Japan has developed an arsenal of defenses to fight against floods and minimize their impacts. But elsewhere in the world, many cities, even highly developed ones, have not sufficiently anticipated these risks. This is the case of New York. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy sadly revealed the total absence of protective measures taken in the city. For too long, the American authorities ignored the warnings of nature. And for several years now, many scientists have brought to light a new threat.
This little white box behind me is a very famous tide gauge. It's the second oldest tide gauge in the whole United States. It's been faithfully measuring the tides, the rise and fall of the tides every day since the last 150 years or more.
In recent decades, the sea level has increased significantly in the New York region. On average, the sea has risen by 4 millimeters compared to the 3 millimeters of the rest of the world. This difference may be explained by the complex geological processes occurring on the American continent.
Now this rising, we're measuring here up to date, is mainly what's called the continental rebound from the last ice age, when the whole North American continent was covered in ice. After the ice melted, the land lifted up, like a loaf of bread being baked, and the crust rises. But at the edges here, New York, it's actually going down. The whole thing is tilting. And so, even though in the middle of the country it's going up, here it's going down. And it's going down about 35 centimeters every 100 years. But that will accelerate. With climate change from excess burning of fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas into the atmosphere, we can expect the water level here to rise 1 or 2 meters before the end of this century. And that's a lot. That's a lot to worry about. Behind me is New York Harbor, and past the Statue of Liberty, we have the ocean. For many years, I've been proposing that we need a regional solution to the protection of New York City and northern New Jersey. Not just a New York City solution, not just a New Jersey solution, but a combined solution. The plan is to construct European-style storm surge barriers across the entrance to the harbor where the Hudson River empties into the ocean.
The oceanographer has therefore designed a barrage to be constructed off the coast. A huge structure, several tens of kilometers long, to ensure the protection of the city from the effects of storms. Several countries decided a long time ago to build such structures. In the Netherlands, a third of the lands are situated below sea level. The Dutch have built over 25 kilometers of barriers since the 1950s. The one at Oosterschelde, which is 9 kilometers long, is the longest in the world. In England, downstream from London, the Thames Barrier also protects the city from sea floods. These lines of defense have proved to be effective against the tides and the storms, but the New Yorkers refused this option.
The concept of the storm surge barriers have been out there really since a little bit before Sandy, and then even in the aftermath of Sandy, the conversation grew a little louder. There's a false sense of security that comes with this idea that there's going to be a big wall that's going to protect us from the ocean. Instead, we need to find a better way to re-engage with water and recognize that we're going to do everything we can to reduce that flood risk in projects that fit the local environment in a much better way, that address the long-term sea level rise condition, that also provide protection against coastal storms, and that we can begin working on right now.
Reconnecting with water, being in harmony with the environment, adapting. Behind these terms lies a new concept, that of resilience. The Americans who support this movement believe that New York cannot totally protect itself from floods. The city, therefore, has no other option than to accept its fate. It needs to be able to bounce back, reinvent itself, and live with the threat.
So our vision for resiliency is that our neighborhoods, our economy, our essential public services are ready to withstand and emerge stronger from both the impacts of climate change and other 21st century threats. And it's the linkage of those two things. It's the reduced impacts and it's the quicker recovery times that really encompass what we mean by resiliency here in New York City.
Urban resilience is the ability of a city not just to bounce back, but in fact to thrive and grow in the face of both acute events, which we call shocks, and chronic events that we call stresses. We're looking for better outcomes in cities. In shocks, that can mean how quickly do cities get back to normal? How are they able to go on? You look at New York City, for instance. Over the last 15 years, it had 9/11 terrorist attacks, a big blackout, as well as the crash of and the housing crisis that affected its primary industry, the financial services sector. And yet, the city has been able to weather those events, along with Superstorm Sandy, and really continue to thrive in the face of them. So that looks like a little bit of what a resilient city is.
You are not alone. We will recover, we will rebuild, we will come back stronger together. That's my promise as your president.
The reconstruction of New York depends on its capacity for resilience and on taking into account the climatic threat. Re-elected for a second term of office a few days after the passage of Hurricane Sandy, the president wants to rethink the city from a more global perspective. Under the name of Rebuild by Design, Barack Obama's project is entrusted to a global expert in water management, the Dutchman Henk Ovink. This specialist believes in the need for a holistic approach.
I remember my first interview when I moved to New York and DC, and the interview was on New York 1, and the first question was asked, "So, Mr. Ovink, are you going to build this storm surge barrier next to the Verrazano Bridge and safeguard the region forever?" And I said, "No, because it will not. There is no silver bullet when it comes to climate change. You'll need a lot of silver bullets. You need a multitude of interventions that on a regional, programmatic scale, during times to come, can actually build resiliency." We invested months in collaborating with hundreds of organizations, thousands of people, selecting 10 interdisciplinary, world-talented teams that worked in the region to only do research, to capture the region's vulnerabilities and interdependencies, also capture the stories, the experiences of all the people that were hit hard by Sandy. And out of that research, a real regional understanding emerged.
This consultation process led to the creation of several open-air laboratories intended to invent global solutions for New York. Their objective, to rethink urban planning to ensure better protection for the city while reconciling it with water. Focusing on Manhattan, a project entitled Big U or Dryline embodies this new approach. Here, protective barriers are integrated within designs which fulfill other useful functions.
In a way, the Big U is inspired by the High Line. The High Line is this elevated park here on the west side of Manhattan that has been placed on top of a decommissioned rail yard.
This former elevated railway track in the heart of Manhattan has been converted into a promenade. It has become extremely popular with New Yorkers.
So the design process we have used is that we took all of the flood recommendations that have been developed for the entire Lower Manhattan. We've asked people what are their concerns, what are their demands, what are their dreams for their waterfront, and try to see if we can take the necessity and the utility of flood protection and combine it with the dreams and the desires of the local community. And as a result, the dry line is almost like an urban chameleon, that it changes character and appearance depending on what neighborhood it goes through. Sometimes it occupies the space under the elevated highway and turns it into pavilions or tipping platforms. Other times it's almost like a giant bench, and at other times it's part of the landscape that raises and actually protects the park on the waterfront from the noise of the highway, but also protects the city from flooding.
With this project, the architects hope to profoundly change the inhabitants' relationship to water.
Historically, Central Park has been the waterfront of Manhattan. That's where, all the tall buildings and people live and look out at this giant piece of man-made nature. Whereas, for instance, up on the Upper East Side, you have residential towers that look in towards the city, but then even though they're facing the waterfront, they have closed walls practically, because back then the waterfront, there was industry, it was noise, it was ships and trains and cargo. So historically, Manhattan has almost turned its back on the water. And I think now what you've seen over the last decades is that the city is really rediscovering the water. The water is no longer purely utility. You can see the former piers turning into parks. And I think with the big U, this sort of necessary infrastructure for flood protection is actually going to maybe finalize the recolonization of the water for the life of the citizens of New York.
Further south in Manhattan, the region of Staten Island was also seriously affected by Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Here, the architects have sought to approach the question of flood protection while addressing environmental issues.
As landscape architects, we have a much wider view of the world and how cultural and natural systems are interrelated. Our project is really one that's trying to essentially adapt to an environment that is rapidly already shifting. We have acidifying waters. We have sea level rise, which is projected in some cases to be 32 inches or upwards of 32 inches in the outer harbor area, which is an incredible amount, if you can picture that.
To address this challenge, the architect Kate Orff has thought of placing natural obstacles on the seabed along the coast.
We will need to be thinking about how to live next to the water and with the water, to have multiple lines of defense. And the point of this project is also that it is a breakwater that is engineered to withstand wave action and the highest waves. We are designing it to certain wave heights and wave velocities, and that breakwater is then seeded with oysters. And so the oysters are not only a great way to engage the community, to help kind of integrate a sort of a learning about our shared kind of resiliency context into the project. They also protect the structure because of their kind of calcium carbonate buildup. And they serve essentially like a protective coating, and they provide habitat. So for me, it's a really critical point that this is a layered system. It's been, it's not just like, oh, oyster reefs, bring oyster reefs back to the harbor. This is a project that is synthesizing past and future. It's looking towards the past, which is, New York was settled originally on literally oyster shells, right? Our streets used to be oyster shells. There were oyster middens all around Jamaica Bay and Staten Island. What's different about the approach is that we have both a combination of onshore and offshore strategies, the reef and the dune, and together they reduce wave action, prevent erosion, and then essentially rebuild the shoreline. So rather than a conventional breakwater, which is just one size of a unit of rock piled up in a very uniform section, we have what we call reef streets, which are this kind of crenellated pattern where the reef streets are lined with this low pH ecological concrete. And these units are devised and designed specifically as finfish habitat, so the finfish can sort of dart in and escape predators and then come back out. So the goal is that combined with the seeding of the breakwater with oysters through the Billion Oyster Project, who's been a longtime collaborator with us, that this is a project that is really a win-win.
The urban planners of the Rebuild by Design project have decided to redesign the city to reconcile it with water while respecting the environment. But today, only a part of New York is concerned by these protective infrastructures. The population of New York therefore remains exposed to flood risks. How can one protect cities from flooding without enclosing them with walls and barriers? In Europe, Hamburg has succeeded in addressing this challenge in the inner city district of Hafen City. Exposed to the North Sea, the German city has experienced impressive floods in recent decades.
This is one of the areas of Hamburg which are regularly flooded in case of a heavy storm surge. For instance, in 1962, when we had a very heavy storm surge, the water was standing up here, and at the heaviest storm surge we ever had, it was standing up here. And to deal with this type of hazard, people have here in the houses these big steel doors which are closed in case that the water is coming.
Situated in a flood zone, the new district of Hafen City has been entirely elevated to protect it from violent storms from the North Sea.
Hafen City is an island in the river Elbe estuary, and it is supposed to bear 45,000 jobs and tremendous development in terms of residential and commercial developments. So how can you protect this area against the high flooding risk coming from the North Sea? We decided to raise the land in order to leave the linkage between the land and the water in terms of visibility, and on the outside to protect the area.
This solution presents the benefit of addressing the need for cities to expand while providing an answer to the risk of flooding.
The concept of Hafen City in terms of flood protection and integrating a flood protection system with a new urban living and design style for buildings is extremely unique internationally. On the one hand side, it is a protection system which does not exist in any big city of the world. And secondly, it keeps the relationship between water and the public spaces and the private ones. And the interesting point is that it is a joint vision of protecting this part of the city for the next 100 or 200 years. Hafen City concept can be very much a model for other cities, especially when you build parts of the city anew. Then you can really raise the land and not avoid to keep a big distance between the preferred waterfront locations on the other hand and having a protective risk secure location to build on. So I think in locations, for example, in the northern US or in other areas of the world, that can be a forward-looking base concept. It could also be a concept for many Asian cities which are built on new low-lying floodplains, and thus the benefit of having a flood-protected solution and building cities anew close to the waterfront could be spreading from the idea of Hafen City to many more places which are now looking into solutions to be developed.
In future, on the outskirts of big urban centres, we shall see the emergence of new developments built over the water to ensure them better protection against flooding. To provide an answer to the increasing threats of flooding, urban planners all over the world are trying to protect big cities from the attacks of the sea. And in some cases, they are even reshaping the coastal landscape.
The area we're living in now is called the Anthropocene, which is essentially the era where human impact is the greatest force on the geological changes of our planet. That human impact, we dam rivers, we flood valleys, we cause glaciers to melt, we cause deforestation, desertification, we transform landscapes with different fields of agriculture, and we're causing the sea levels to rise. So in that sense, you can say the human power to transform our planet at a planetary scale is becoming evident. And as Spider-Man's dad says, with great power comes great responsibility.
The water crisis is the #1 global risk when it comes to crisis. And it is hitting our societies, our communities, and our cities worse than ever, and it's going to increase over time. Are we ready for the change in those risks? No, we're not. 2 to 4 billion people will be devastated in the next decades when it comes to water. And it's too much water because of sea level rise and surges, or too little water and drought and a bad quality of the water because man-made pollution, man-made environmental catastrophes.
The human, environmental and economic challenges are huge. The big cities, which are at the origin of these profound changes, will have to adapt. The question is, will resilience provide a new answer in the fight against floods?
We have to work and build a new mindset. We talk about this idea of resilience, that resilience is not just about building hard infrastructure and building protective walls, but it's about changing the mindset of citizens, changing the way governments and people who manage cities think about the future. You have to basically be ready to accept the unpredictable, accept and embrace uncertainty. It's no longer a world in which you can predict and plan and you will know exactly what the outcome is going to be 5 or 10 years down the road. We're not going to ultimately stop the risk of flooding, but it's also about how do we manage that both before, during, and after.
I think resilience, resilience, what does it mean, resilio? It's the ability to bounce back if you literally kind of look it up in the dictionary. And some people say maybe it's helping people to help themselves. I don't think that would be enough in many of the coastal cities that we see around the world. There's so much exposed and without a significant government effort to adapt, I think we'll see very bad problems in the coming years.
Some people say there might be a Sandy #2. Well, yes and no. I mean, no two storms are ever the same. No two storms strike the coast at exactly the same place. But there will be other catastrophes because of where New York City is. It's in the path of hurricanes that we have every year. The next storm will be different, but it could be just as devastating.
We all want a future that is actually able to deal with increasing risk. If we look at the facts in all the reports, the burden is upon us to deal with those uncertainties. So if we want that future for our children and grandchildren, if we want to be able to live tomorrow as we live today or even better, we really have to invest more to be able to deal with these increasing facts.